The morning of June 19, 1944, began with a sound that Japanese naval aviators had learned to dread more than any other in the Pacific War, a deep, throbbing growl rolling across the sky above the Philippine Sea, the unmistakable signature of nearly 400 American fighters climbing to meet them. And within a few hours, that single day would be remembered by the men who survived it on both sides as the moment Japan's once-feared carrier air power was broken beyond repair. Not by superior numbers alone, but by a single American aircraft that Japanese pilots had come to regard with a strange and uneasy mixture of respect and outright fear, the Grumman F6F Hellcat, a machine so effective against the legendary Mitsubishi Zero that some surviving Japanese aviators later admitted they felt a cold knot in their stomachs the instant they spotted its distinctive blunt nose and bubble canopy silhouetted against the clouds, because by then they knew, with grim certainty born of bitter experience, that the aircraft climbing toward them was built specifically to kill them, and it was very, very good at its job. But to understand why the Hellcat earned that reputation, why veteran Japanese pilots who had once dominated the skies over China, the Philippines, and the East Indies came to view this particular American fighter as something fundamentally different from anything they had faced before, the story must begin not in 1944, but 2.5 years earlier, in the smoke and confusion of December 1941, when the Mitsubishi A6M seemed less like an aircraft and more like an unstoppable force of nature, a fighter so nimble, so long-ranged, and so lethal in the hands of Japan's highly trained pre-war pilots that Allied aircrews initially refused to believe American intelligence reports describing its performance, and for the first year of the Pacific War, the Zero more than lived up to its terrifying reputation, out-turning, out-climbing, and outlasting nearly every fighter the Allies could put into the air, leaving American naval aviators flying obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and underpowered early Grumman Wildcats to develop desperate tactics simply to survive an encounter, let alone win one. And it was this crisis, this realization that American naval aviation faced a genuine technological and tactical emergency in the Pacific, that set in motion the chain of events leading to the creation of the aircraft that would ultimately turn the tables so completely that Japanese pilots would come to fear it above all others. Because even before Pearl Harbor, Grumman engineers had already begun sketching designs for a more powerful successor to the Wildcat. But it was the shock of early combat reports, and especially the now famous recovery of a nearly intact Zero that had crash-landed on the remote Aleutian island of Akutan in June 1942, that transformed those design studies into an urgent national priority. Because when American technicians painstakingly repaired that captured Zero and flight tested it against contemporary American fighters at Naval Air Station North Island, they discovered with sobering clarity exactly why their pilots had been struggling, learning that the Zero achieved its astonishing agility and range through a ruthless sacrifice of protection, its airframe stripped of armor plating, its fuel tanks lacking any self-sealing capability, every ounce of unnecessary weight eliminated in pursuit of performance, a design philosophy that produced a magnificent dogfighter, but also a fighter that could be destroyed by a single well-placed burst of gunfire, information that flowed directly into the design refinement of Grumman's new fighter, designated the F6F Hellcat, an aircraft conceived from the outset not to outmaneuver the Zero in a classic turning dogfight, a contest American engineers now understood was unwinnable by design, but to overwhelm it through raw power, structural toughness, and devastating firepower. And when the first Hellcats rolled off Grumman's Bethpage, New York production line in 1942, they represented a fundamentally different approach to aerial combat, built around the massive 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine producing roughly 2,000 horsepower, nearly double the output of the Zero's Nakajima Sake power plant, giving the Hellcat a top speed advantage of more than 50 miles per hour and a rate of climb that allowed American pilots to dictate the terms of every engagement, choosing when to dive, when to strike, and when to disengage, rather than being forced into the close, twisting dogfights where the Zero's legendary maneuverability had once guaranteed victory. And beyond raw power, the Hellcat carried 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns capable of throwing a devastating weight of fire that could shred the Zero's unprotected fuel tanks and unarmored cockpit in a fraction of a second, while the Hellcat's own pilots sat behind armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks that allowed American aircraft to absorb punishment that would have instantly destroyed a Zero, meaning that in engagement after engagement, American pilots could survive hits that proved fatal to their opponents, a brutal asymmetry that Japanese pilots discovered with increasing horror as 1943 progressed, and the Hellcat began arriving in the Pacific Theater, in growing numbers, first seeing combat in August 1943 over Marcus Island, and quickly proving itself in the skies above the Solomon Islands and the Gilbert and Marshall Chains, where veteran Japanese aviators, men who had survived years of combat and considered themselves masters of aerial warfare, began returning from missions shaken by encounters with an American fighter that simply refused to behave the way the Wildcat had, refusing to be lured into low-speed turning fights, instead using altitude and speed to strike from above, fire devastating bursts, and climb away before a Zero pilot could bring his own guns to bear. And this tactical discipline, this willingness to fight on American terms rather than Japanese terms, frustrated and unnerved pilots accustomed into imposing their will on every engagement. But the technological superiority of the Hellcat alone does not fully explain the depth of fear and respect it generated among Japanese aviators, because by 1943 and 1944, a second, equally devastating factor was compounding the crisis facing Japanese naval air power, a catastrophic decline in the quality of Japanese pilot training that meant the men flying against the Hellcat were, with increasing frequency, no longer the elite veterans of 1941 and 1942, but desperately undertrained replacements rushed into combat to replace the irreplaceable losses suffered at Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, and the long, brutal campaign through the Solomons, a crisis rooted in a fundamental strategic miscalculation Japan had made before the war even began, because the Imperial Japanese Navy's pre-war pilot training program, while producing aviators of extraordinary individual skill, was designed to create a small elite force rather than a sustainable pipeline capable of replacing combat losses at scale, with prospective naval aviators undergoing a grueling selection and training process that could take years and washed out the vast majority of candidates, producing magnificent pilots but far too few of them, while the United States, recognizing early that a war of attrition in the Pacific would ultimately be decided by the ability to replace losses, dramatically expanded and streamlined its own naval aviator training pipeline, producing thousands of competent, if individually less experienced pilots who entered combat back at be increasingly sophisticated squadron tactics, most notably the Thach Weave, a mutual support maneuver developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thach, specifically to counter the Zero's maneuverability advantage by having pairs of American fighters cross paths to bring concentrated fire on any enemy aircraft attempting to exploit a turning advantage, a tactic that had proven valuable even in the Wildcat years and became devastatingly effective once paired with the Hellcat's raw performance superiority, and as the war ground on through 1943 into 1944. This widening gap in pilot quality, combined with the technological superiority of the Hellcat, created a vicious cycle for Japan, because every experienced pilot lost in combat against American Hellcats had to be replaced by an aviator with progressively less training, fewer flight hours and less combat experience, a degradation accelerated by Japan's worsening fuel shortages, which further curtailed training flight hours for new pilots even as American training programs in places like Pensacola and Corpus Christi continued operating at full capacity, producing a steady stream of increasingly capable naval aviators. And it was against this backdrop of compounding crisis that the Battle of the Philippine Sea unfolded in June 1944, an engagement that would become known to American aviators by the almost mocking nickname the Marianas Turkey Shoot, a battle that crystallized everything that had gone wrong for Japanese naval aviation and everything that had gone right for the Hellcat program. Because when Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa launched his carrier aircraft against the American fleet, defending the invasion of Saipan on June 19, 1944, he was sending pilots who were, on average, dramatically less experienced than their American counterparts against an American defense, built around hundreds of Hellcats flown by increasingly battle-hardened aviators, supported by an early warning radar network that gave American fighter direction officers precious minutes to vector intercepting Hellcats to altitude advantage before the Japanese strikes even arrived, And what followed was less a battle in the traditional sense than a systematic destruction. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft cut down by Hellcats, diving from superior altitude, American pilots like Commander David McCampbell of Air Group 15 tearing into Japanese formations with a confidence and aggression that reflected complete faith in their aircraft's superiority. McCampbell himself claiming multiple kills that single day on his way to becoming the US Navy's leading ace of the entire war, with 34 confirmed victories, almost all of them flying the Hellcat, while pilots like Lieutenant Alexander Vrakiu of the carrier Lexington shot down 6 Japanese dive bombers in a single mission that June afternoon, a feat that became legendary within naval aviation circles. And by the time the sun set on June 19th, Japan had lost roughly 250 carrier aircraft, a staggering proportion of Ozawa's available strike force, for the loss of only a handful of American Hellcats, a kill ratio so lopsided that it stunned commanders on both sides and effectively destroyed Japan's ability to project carrier-based air power for the remainder of the war. And the following day, June 20th, American carrier aircraft located and struck Ozawa's retreating fleet at extreme range, sinking additional ships and aircraft in a dusk attack that, while costly to American air crews, forced to make hazardous night landings on their return, completed the destruction of Japan's carrier air arm as an effective fighting force. And it was in the aftermath of battles like this one that the true psychological dimension of the Hellcat's reputation among Japanese aviators began to crystallize, because surviving Japanese pilots, debriefed after the Philippine Sea and subsequent engagements, increasingly described a sense of fatalism when facing American fighters, an awareness that even skilled maneuvering often proved futile against an aircraft that could absorb hits, outrun pursuit, and bring devastating firepower to bear with brutal efficiency. And this fear was not merely about individual aircraft performance, but reflected a deeper, more unsettling recognition among Japanese aviators that the entire character of the air war had shifted irreversibly against them, that the skies which had once belonged to Japan's elite pre-war aviators now belonged decisively to American industrial and training capacity, translated into machines like the Hellcat, flown increasingly by pilots who, while perhaps individually less flamboyant than the legendary Japanese aces of 1941, fought with disciplined tactics, mutual support, and the confidence that came from flying an aircraft built to survive mistakes that would prove fatal in a zero. And this respect, grudging as it often was, extended even to some of Japan's most accomplished surviving aces, several of whom acknowledged in post-war accounts that the Hellcat represented a fundamentally superior fighting machine to anything Japan fielded by 1944, not necessarily more elegant or more maneuverable in the classic sense, but more lethal in the brutal calculus of actual combat, where survivability and firepower mattered more than aerobatic grace. And as American forces pushed closer to the Japanese home islands through late 1944 and into 1945, striking targets at Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and eventually the Japanese mainland itself, the Hellcat continued its grim work, flying combat air patrol missions that intercepted increasing numbers of kamikaze aircraft during the brutal Okinawa campaign of spring 1945, a role that added yet another dimension to its reputation, because Hellcat pilots flying defensive patrols around the American fleet off Okinawa frequently found themselves racing to intercept suicide aircraft before they could reach their targets, a desperate, high-stakes form of combat that demanded split-second decisions and put enormous pressure on fighter direction officers and pilots alike. And it was during this period that Hellcat squadrons, including Navy night fighter variants equipped with airborne radar, extended their effectiveness into round-the-clock operations, hunting Japanese aircraft attempting to slip through under cover of darkness, a capability that further expanded the aircraft's reach and reinforced among Japanese aviators the unsettling sense that there was no safe hour to fly against the American fleet. And throughout this final brutal phase of the Pacific Air War, the production numbers told their own story of industrial dominance, with Grumman's Bethpage factory supplemented by an Eastern Aircraft Division plant in Linden, New Jersey, ultimately producing more than 12,000 Hellcats during the course of the war, a manufacturing achievement that allowed American carrier air groups to maintain full strength, even after losses, while Japan struggled increasingly to replace not just pilots, but the aircraft themselves, as American submarine and air attacks strangled the supply chains and raw materials Japanese industry depended upon. And by war's end, the cumulative statistics surrounding the Hellcat's combat record had become almost difficult to comprehend, with naval aviators flying the type credited with destroying more than 5,000 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, achieving an overall kill ratio against Japanese fighters, including the Zero, that some post-war analyses placed as high as 19-1, a figure so lopsided that it remains one of the most dominant performance records of any fighter aircraft in the history of aerial warfare, a statistic that, however, contested in its precise calculation by different historians, nonetheless reflects an undeniable and overwhelming American advantage in the air war against Japan during the critical final 2 years of the Pacific conflict. And it was this combination of factors, the raw technological superiority embodied in the Hellcat's armor, firepower, and engine performance, the disciplined tactical innovations developed by American naval aviators, and the catastrophic, irreversible decline in Japanese pilot training and experience, that together explain why surviving Japanese aviators came to view the Hellcat with such a distinctive blend of professional respect and genuine fear, because unlike earlier American fighters that Japanese pilots had learned to exploit through superior maneuverability, the Hellcat offered no such reliable advantage to exploit. It simply absorbed punishment, climbed away, and returned to strike again with brutal efficiency, embodying a new philosophy of aerial warfare that prioritized survivability, firepower, and pilot preservation over the kind of delicate aerobatic perfection that had defined the Zero's early dominance. And in this sense, the story of the Hellcat is not merely the story of one excellent aircraft defeating another, but the story of two fundamentally different approaches to total war colliding in the skies over the Pacific. One rooted in an elite, irreplaceable cadre of supremely skilled individual aviators, flying delicate, lightly built machines optimized for offense at the expense of protection. The other, rooted in an industrial philosophy that valued sustainability, pilot survival, and overwhelming material superiority, a philosophy that allowed the United States Navy to absorb losses, replace pilots and aircraft at a pace Japan simply could not match, and ultimately grind down what had once been the most feared carrier air force in the world. And when the formal surrender ceremony took place aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, the skies above the bay were filled with American naval aircraft conducting a massive flyover. Among them, squadrons of Hellcats that had in less than 3 years transformed from an emergency wartime response to a crisis into the single most successful naval fighter of the entire Pacific War, an aircraft whose pilots had broken the back of Japanese carrier aviation in a single devastating afternoon over the Philippine Sea, an aircraft that surviving Japanese aviators, men who had once dismissed American fighters as inferior nuisances, came to recognize, often with a grudging professional respect, mixed with genuine dread, as the machine that had fundamentally and permanently shifted the balance of power in the skies. And today, more than 8 decades later, the legacy of the Grumman F6F Hellcat endures not simply in museum displays or surviving airworthy examples that still draw crowds at air shows, but in the historical memory of a pivotal turning point in the Pacific War, a reminder that air superiority is rarely won by any single factor alone, but by the convergence of engineering excellence, sound tactical doctrine, sustainable industrial production, and the human cost paid by aviators on both sides, who flew into combat knowing that the machine beneath them, and the skill of the pilot in the opposing cockpit, would ultimately determine whether they returned home. And for the Japanese pilots, who survived encounters with the Hellcat, who watched their comrades fall in increasing numbers through 1944 and into 1945, the aircraft became something more than just another American fighter. It became a symbol of a war that Japan was losing, not merely in the skies, but in the factories, training schools, and strategic calculations far removed from any single dogfight. A sobering, hard-earned respect for an adversary that had, through deliberate design and relentless production, built the perfect counter to everything the Zero had once represented, and in that respect, tinged always with fear, lies perhaps the most fitting tribute any enemy could pay to the men and the machine that helped bring the Pacific War to its inevitable end.